James Cooper, a man well known in high society and corporate circles, lived a life most would envy. He owned one of the largest estates in Oregon, a sprawling mansion tucked into the woods, surrounded by acres of pine trees, with a private road winding up from the small town below. Yet with all his wealth and the respect he commanded in his business, James felt more alone than ever. Walking through the forest was one of the few times he could escape the hollow feeling that filled him, something that no luxury car or private jet seemed able to soothe. Out in the woods, he was just another man, moving through nature without pretense. Today was one of those rare days when James left behind the echoing silence of his home and set off on a walk through the forest. The early morning light filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the forest floor. He loved the way the forest smelled this time of year, earthy and damp, with hints of cedar and moss. The sound of birds chirping overhead and the gentle breeze through the branches brought a sense of calm he couldn't find anywhere else. James took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs, grounding himself in the present moment. He often wondered why he felt more at home among the trees than in his own mansion, filled with fine art and polished floors. Perhaps it was the simplicity of it all, the way nature just existed, without the need to impress anyone. The mansion felt cold, despite its grandeur, a beautiful shell with little warmth. He had never been married, and though he'd once dreamed of a family, life had taken him down a different path. Now, at 50, he found himself walking these woods more and more often, and as if searching for something he couldn't name. As he strolled along the winding forest path, his thoughts began to drift. He remembered his father, a stern man who believed that success was the only goal worth pursuing. "Family comes later," his father used to say. James had taken that lesson to heart, climbing the corporate ladder with relentless ambition, until one day he realized he was alone at the top. The thought of his empty mansion waiting for him back up the hill sent a familiar pang through him, a feeling he tried to ignore. Suddenly, a soft sound interrupted his thoughts. He stopped, straining to listen. It was faint, almost blending in with the rustle of leaves, but unmistakable. A small, muffled sob. Frowning, James looked around, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. He thought he must be imagining it, but then he heard it again, a quiet, heartbreaking cry that seemed to echo through the trees. Concerned, he followed the sound, moving carefully over the uneven ground until he spotted a small figure huddled on a fallen log. There, half hidden by the shadows of the trees, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, her small frame dwarfed by the vast forest around her. She was sitting with her head in her hands, her thin shoulders shaking as she cried. James approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. He couldn't imagine what a child would be doing out here alone, and his heart twisted with concern and a strange sense of urgency. This wasn't something he was used to. He dealt with mergers, contracts and negotiations, not children lost in the woods. "Hey there," he called gently, stopping a few feet away from her. The girl flinched, lifting her head with a start. Her face was streaked with dirt, and her wide brown eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. She stared at him, frozen like a deer caught in headlights. James softened his tone, trying to make himself seem as unthreatening as possible. "Are you okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low and calm. "Are you lost?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she clutched a worn, ragged doll closer to her chest, her knuckles turning white as she held on tight. The doll looked as if it had seen better days, its fabric faded and threadbare with a missing button eye. James felt his heart clench as he took in the sight. She looked so small, so vulnerable, sitting there in the middle of the woods with nothing but that doll for comfort. He took a slow step forward, hoping to ease her fear. "It's okay," he said softly. "I won't hurt you." The girl's gaze flickered away from him, and she bit her lip as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she murmured, I don't got anywhere to go." Her voice was so quiet, so full of resignation, that it nearly broke his heart. James knelt down, bringing himself to her level, trying to make himself less intimidating. He knew he looked like a giant compared to her, and he didn't want to scare her off. "My name's James," he said gently, giving her a small smile. "I live nearby, just up the hill. It's a big house, warm, with plenty of food. Would you like to come with me?" She hesitated, her small fingers twisting the hem of her tattered dress. James could see the wariness in her eyes, a guarded look that no child her age should have. She looked at him, searching his face as if trying to see if he was telling the truth. After a long pause, she gave a small nod, reaching out to place her tiny hand in his. Her fingers were cold and rough, and as they began to walk back through the trees, James couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility he'd just taken on. The moment they stepped into James's mansion, Ellie hesitated, her small hand pulling back slightly as she took in the grand, unfamiliar surroundings. The house was unlike anything she'd ever seen, with towering ceilings, polished wood floors that echoed each step, and a soft glow from a chandelier overhead. Her eyes darted around, taking it all in, the grand staircase, the paintings lining the walls, and the vast space that seemed to go on forever. James could feel her grip loosen, her instincts telling her to bolt. He squeezed her hand gently, offering a smile, hoping it would help ease her nerves. "It's okay, Ellie. You're safe here. Let's get you settled." As he led her through the hallway, he could see her eyes shifting, as if she were mentally marking every possible exit. James's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to be so young and so guarded. He wanted her to feel at ease, but he knew it would take time. There was a small, cozy guest room just down the hall from his own, and he led her inside. It was simple, furnished with a bed covered in a soft quilt, a reading chair by the window, and a few shelves holding old books. The room had a view of the backyard, where the trees stretched toward the sky, letting in a soft, dappled light. Ellie stood near the doorway, her eyes on the bed, as if it was something foreign. James noticed her hesitation and tried to sound casual. "This will be your room," he said gently. "You can rest, read, or look out the window, whatever makes you comfortable." She nodded, though she made no move to explore, standing rigidly by the door. James realized she might need something familiar, something she could connect with, and he remembered his old dog, Max, who usually napped by the fireplace. "Would you like to meet Max?" he asked, hoping the warmth of his golden retriever might help break the ice. Ellie's face softened slightly, a hint of curiosity breaking through her guarded expression. "He's a big softy," James added with a grin. "Been with me for years." "Loyal as they come?" At that, Ellie's eyes brightened just a bit and she gave a tiny nod. James led her back down the hall toward the living room, where Max lay sprawled out on the rug, his head resting on his paws. At the sound of footsteps, the dog's ears perked up, and he lifted his head, sniffing the air. Seeing Ellie, Max's tail thumped against the floor, a slow, welcoming wag. Ellie watched Max with cautious interest, her eyes widening as she took in his friendly, gentle face. She didn't move at first, but Max, sensing her hesitation, stayed in place, his eyes soft and calm. James knelt down beside the dog, patting his fur, inviting Ellie to come closer. "He loves attention, but he'll wait for you to make the first move," James said, glancing at her encouragingly. After a long moment, Ellie took a tentative step forward, her small hand reaching out to touch Max's fur. The dog let out a soft sigh of contentment, and Ellie's lips curved into the faintest smile. For the first time since he'd met her, James saw a glimpse of the child she might have been before all the fear and mistrust took hold. That slight smile was like a crack in the armor she'd built around herself, and it gave him hope. "See," he said gently, "Max is a friend just like you." Ellie didn't say anything, but her hand lingered on Max's fur, stroking it slowly, as if testing the waters of something she hadn't felt in a long time: comfort. James watched her, knowing not to push too hard. This was a small step, but an important one. "You must be hungry," he said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. She looked up, her gaze wary again, but there was a hint of something else, perhaps curiosity or even hope. James led her to the kitchen, where he set out simple ingredients for a meal. He didn't want to overwhelm her, so he chose something familiar and comforting: grilled cheese and tomato soup. "I'm not much of a chef," he admitted with a chuckle, "but I think I can handle this." He moved about the kitchen, explaining each step as he prepared the food, hoping the routine would help her relax. Ellie sat quietly at the counter watching him as he worked. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed his every move, as if studying him. James could sense her uncertainty, the way she kept glancing at the door, as though still considering an escape. He tried to keep his tone light, talking about Max and the little quirks of the house, filling the silence with stories meant to make her feel at ease. "This place gets pretty quiet," he said casually. "Just me and Max most of the time. It's nice to have someone else around." When he placed the grilled cheese and soup in front of her, Ellie stared at it for a moment, as though unsure if it was really hers. James waited patiently, watching as she took a cautious first bite. The tension in her shoulders began to ease, and she ate slowly, savoring each bite as if she hadn't had a warm meal in days. Watching her, James felt a strange warmth in his chest, a mix of empathy and protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. "There's plenty more if you're still hungry," he offered. But she shook her head, her gaze dropping to her plate. As she finished her meal, James poured himself a cup of coffee, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. He could see she was still guarded, but there was a softness in her eyes now, a faint hint of trust beginning to form. "You know, Ellie," he said gently, "I don't know what brought you here, but I'm glad you're safe now." She looked up, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, he thought she might say something, but she simply nodded, her gaze shifting back to her plate, and he knew better than to push. That night, as the house settled into its usual silence, James found himself drawn to the small guest room where Ellie was staying. After dinner, she'd wandered back there, sitting by the window and watching the forest outside. It was a quiet night, the trees casting soft shadows, and there was something almost comforting about the stillness. James knocked gently on the doorframe. Noticing the way her gaze didn't move from the window, lost in thoughts far away. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, keeping his tone soft. Ellie glanced over her shoulder, giving him a hesitant nod, before returning her gaze to the window. James took a seat on the edge of the bed, careful to keep a respectful distance. There was something about the way she looked tonight, small, fragile, as if holding onto memories she couldn't shake. James wanted to help, but he knew better than to push. Instead, he waited, letting the silence stretch out, giving her space to speak when she was ready. After a few moments, Ellie broke the silence with a voice barely above a whisper. "My mom used to tell me stories," she said, her words tentative, as if testing how much she could trust him. "She'd say one day we'd live somewhere nice, maybe with a yard and a garden." Her fingers played with the edge of the quilt, her face a mixture of sadness and longing. James listened quietly, listened, realizing how much those dreams must have meant to her and how cruel it was that they had never come true. "Where is she now?" he asked softly, trying to keep his voice gentle and understanding. Ellie's eyes dropped, her fingers clutching the quilt tighter. "She left," she murmured. "She said she'd be back, but she didn't come. I waited and waited." Her voice trailed off, and James could see the pain in her eyes, a deep hurt that no child should ever have to carry. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, one he hadn't felt in years, as if he could feel her abandonment as his own. "I'm so sorry, Ellie," he said, not knowing what else to say. It was such a small thing, but he hoped it would be enough. He knew from experience that words rarely fixed anything, but they could offer a little comfort, a reminder that someone else understood. Ellie didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either, and James took that as a small sign of trust. He could see himself in her, a child who had been left to fend for herself, forced to grow up too soon. Ellie's gaze remained fixed on the window, her small face illuminated by the soft moonlight filtering in through the glass. "She used to say we'd have a real family someday," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "She said things would get better." Her words hung in the air, and James felt the weight of them, the promise of something better that never came. He felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him, an urge to make sure she never had to wait for anyone else's promises again. He wanted to be there for her, to show her that she could count on him. "Sometimes people, they don't know how to take care of others, even if they want to," James said gently, hoping to explain in a way that wouldn't make her feel abandoned again. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to say, but he wanted her to understand that her mother's absence wasn't her fault. He had grown up with parents who were physically present but emotionally absent, and he remembered how it felt to question his own worth because of it. "It's not your fault, Ellie," he added softly. Ellie looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if she was trying to decide if she could believe him. For a moment, he thought she might cry, but she blinked, holding back her tears. "She used to say I was her little star," she whispered, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "She said I was bright and special." James felt his heart ache at those words, knowing how much they must have meant to her, and how much harder it must have been when her mother left. He wanted to tell her that she was still bright and special, that she hadn't lost that spark. "You know," he said, a gentle smile on his face, "I think she was right. You are pretty special." Ellie's face softened, her shoulders relaxing just a bit. It was just a small moment, a glimmer of light breaking through her sadness, but it felt like a victory. He could see the walls she'd built around herself slowly beginning to crumble, her heart opening just a little. James reached out, gently placing his hand over hers, feeling her tiny fingers squeeze back, seeking comfort in the simplest of gestures. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, but connected in a way that didn't need words. James thought about his own life, about the choices he'd made, and the sacrifices that had left him alone in this big house. For the first time, he didn't feel that solitude as acutely. Ellie's presence filled a part of him he hadn't realized was empty. He knew he couldn't change her past, but he wanted to be part of her future, to offer her the stability she'd never had over the next few days. James and Ellie settled into a quiet, comfortable routine. Mornings began with the soft light streaming through the tall windows of the mansion, casting a warm glow over the wooden floors and filling the air with a gentle stillness. James would wake early, preparing coffee in the kitchen and watching as the morning fog slowly lifted from the trees outside. Ellie, a light sleeper, would often wander in a few minutes later, her hair messy, rubbing her eyes with one hand while holding her beloved doll with the other. They shared a simple breakfast, with James often preparing something warm, a habit he'd developed over years of solitude, but was now quietly happy to share. Ellie would watch him as he moved around the kitchen, sometimes offering a small smile or a quiet thank you that made James's day. He could see her relaxing a bit more each morning, as if the predictability of their shared routine brought her a sense of safety she hadn't known in a long time. He noticed that she seemed more at ease with Max. 2. The golden retriever had taken a particular liking to her, often resting his head on her lap during breakfast, his tail thumping on the floor whenever she pet him. Ellie's small laughter, a rare and gentle sound, would fill the kitchen when Max nudged her for more attention, and James couldn't help but smile at the sight. After breakfast, James would retreat to his study to work. It was a familiar rhythm for him, diving into emails and calls, but now there was a small but comforting difference, the faint sound of Ellie exploring the house. Sometimes he'd hear her footsteps echo down the hallway, or catch her soft murmur as she talked to Max, who had taken it upon himself to follow her wherever she went. She'd wander from room to room, occasionally peeking her head into his study to give a shy wave or simply observe him at work. He'd look up from his screen, returning the wave with a smile, each time feeling a quiet warmth at her presence. Ellie seemed fascinated by the little things in the house, the bookshelves in the library, the way the sunlight streamed through the windows in the afternoon, casting patterns on the floor. She'd sit in the big armchair by the window, flipping through old books, some of which were far too complex for her, but held a certain charm simply because they belonged to James. Once he found her curled up with a thick history book, her eyes wide with fascination as she traced the faded pictures. "You like history?" he'd asked, and she'd shrugged, mumbling something about how it was kinda cool. It was small, but each interaction brought her a step closer to him piece by piece. In the evenings, they'd settle into a simple rhythm of cooking dinner together, often laughing as they tried new recipes or made a mess in the process. James wasn't much of a cook, but Ellie seemed to enjoy watching him fumble with pots and pans. She'd giggle whenever he burnt something, and he'd laugh with her, feeling the lightness she brought into his life. They'd sit at the large dining table, sharing quiet conversations over their meal, and though the words were few, the connection between them grew with each night. It was as though they were creating a shared world, something they both needed more than either had realized. As Ellie grew more comfortable, her curiosity took hold, and she began exploring every nook and cranny of the mansion. She'd race up and down the grand staircase, fascinated by the echoes her footsteps created in the wide hallways. She loved the way the floors creaked in certain spots, giggling as she jumped to find the loudest ones. James would hear her laughter bouncing off the walls, a sound he hadn't heard in his home in years. It was a simple joy, but it transformed the house in ways he couldn't put into words. The once silent mansion now felt alive, filled with Ellie's energy and laughter. One afternoon, James found her in the attic, standing in front of an old chest, her eyes wide with excitement. She looked up at him with a grin and asked, "Can I open it?" He nodded, surprised by her enthusiasm, and watched as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside were relics from his own childhood, old toys, photos, and keepsakes he'd forgotten about. Ellie rummaged through them, pulling out a dusty baseball glove, an old comic book, and a tiny wooden horse that had once been his favorite toy. Seeing her hold his memories in her small hands brought back a wave of nostalgia, and he found himself telling her stories about his own childhood. something he hadn't done in years. They spent that afternoon going through the items together, with James sharing snippets of his past and Ellie listening intently, her eyes bright with interest. He could tell she enjoyed hearing about his life, perhaps because it made him feel more like a person and less like just the man who had taken her in. She asked questions, her curiosity unguarded, and he answered them all, realizing how much he enjoyed these small conversations. Sharing his past with her felt natural, as though she'd always been a part of his life, and he could see how much it meant to her too. These moments, however small, strengthened the bond between them. As the days passed, James noticed a change in himself too. He found himself looking forward to their quiet mornings, their shared meals, and the small, unexpected moments of laughter. His home, once a place he'd merely inhabited, now felt like a true sanctuary, filled with warmth and life. The silence that had once been his companion was now replaced by the sound of Ellie's footsteps, her laughter, and the gentle hum of routine. He felt a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years, as if Ellie had filled a void he hadn't even known was there. She had given his life a purpose beyond work, beyond wealth, something far deeper and more meaningful. Ellie too seemed to blossom in the new environment. Her posture was more relaxed, her eyes brighter, and her laughter more frequent. She no longer jumped at small noises or kept her distance, but instead roamed freely, her trust in James growing each day. She'd often sit beside him in the evenings, sharing small stories about her day, her words simple but meaningful. She spoke about her favorite spots in the house, her favorite meals, and even about Max, who had quickly become her closest companion. Watching her open up and find joy in these little things was, to James, one of the most rewarding experiences of his life. It was a quiet morning, the kind of morning James had come to cherish. Sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the kitchen with a warm, golden glow as he prepared breakfast. Ellie was humming softly to herself as she set the table. Her once guarded expression now relaxed, her shoulders free from the tension she carried when she first arrived. Max lay by her feet, tail wagging gently as he waited for his share of breakfast. For the first time in what felt like forever, James felt that his life had taken on a new meaning, but that peaceful feeling was shattered by a knock at the door. James frowned, surprised. He rarely had visitors, and those who knew him well would never show up unannounced. Ellie froze, the color draining from her face as she stared at the door, her wide eyes filled with a sudden, unmistakable fear. "Do you know who it might be?" he asked gently, but Ellie didn't respond. She seemed to shrink into herself, clutching her doll tightly as if it were a shield. James gave her a reassuring nod and went to answer the door, feeling an uneasy prickle at the back of his neck. Standing on the front step was a man who looked rough around the edges, his clothes wrinkled and worn, his face unshaven. He had an air of impatience, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, and his eyes darted around, never settling on James for long. "You got my niece in there," he said without a greeting, his tone sharp and direct. "I'm her uncle, and I've come to take her home." James could feel something off about the man's demeanor, his insistence, his restlessness. Something didn't feel right. "Ellie," James called softly, not taking his eyes off the stranger. She appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her small figure visibly trembling as she saw the man. Her reaction was immediate. She took a step back, clutching her doll even tighter, her face twisted in terror. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, no." That single phrase sent a chill down James's spine. He looked back at the man, his protective instincts kicking in. "I don't know who you are, but she's clearly not comfortable going with you," James said, his voice calm but firm, the man's face twisted with irritation. And he took a step forward, his voice rising in anger. "She's my niece. I've been looking all over for her. She belongs with family, not with some stranger." James felt his jaw tighten, every instinct telling him that this man had no right to Ellie. He could see the panic in her eyes, the way her small body seemed to shrink with fear at the sight of her so-called uncle. "She's safe here," James replied evenly. "And I don't intend to send her with anyone she's clearly afraid of." The man's eyes flashed with frustration, and he clenched his fists at his sides. "Look, buddy, I don't have to explain myself to you. She's my niece, and I'm taking her home. If you don't hand her over, I'll call the cops and let them handle it." James didn't flinch. He knew his rights, and he wasn't about to let this stranger bully him or Ellie into doing anything against their will. He stepped between the man and Ellie, his stance protective. "If you feel the need to involve the authorities, go right ahead," he said, his voice steady. "But until then, Ellie's staying right here." Ellie watched the exchange with wide eyes. Her face pale, her breath shallow and fast. James could feel the fear radiating off of her, and he felt his resolve harden. He wasn't going to let this man intimidate her or take her away. The man hesitated, clearly taken aback by James's calm resistance. He looked over James's shoulder at Ellie, his eyes narrowing, and James could see a flash of something dangerous in his expression. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the look faded, replaced by a forced smile. "Fine," the man said, his tone laced with barely suppressed anger. "I'll be back. And when I return, I'll have the paperwork to prove she's mine." James didn't respond, his expression unwavering as he held the man's gaze. After a tense moment, the man turned on his heel and stalked down the driveway, his footsteps heavy with frustration. James waited until he was out of sight before closing the door, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Ellie, who was still clutching her doll, her small body trembling. "You're safe," he said gently, walking over to her and placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of collapsing. "I don't want to go with him," she whispered. Her voice choked with fear. James knelt beside her, looking into her eyes. "You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to," he assured her, his voice soft but firm. "You're safe here with me, and I'll make sure it stays that way." They spent the rest of the day in a tense silence, both of them shaken by the encounter. James couldn't shake the feeling that this man's appearance was just the beginning of something more complicated. He'd seen the look in the man's eyes, the barely hidden anger, and he knew that this wasn't the last time they'd have to deal with him. But as he watched Ellie slowly relax, finding comfort in Max's warm presence beside her, James resolved to do whatever it took to protect her. This house was her safe haven now, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. The days following the unexpected visit from Ellie's supposed uncle left James in a state of deep reflection and unease. The man's abrupt arrival, his aggressive tone, and most of all, the terror in Ellie's eyes haunted James, nagging at him like a splinter he couldn't remove. He found himself replaying the encounter, scrutinizing every detail, every word the man had said. Was this man truly Ellie's family? And if he was, what kind of family terrified her so much? James felt a new weight on his shoulders, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. Ellie, for her part, seemed quieter than usual. The trust they'd been building felt shaken, and he noticed how she glanced toward the front door with a look of dread whenever she thought he wasn't looking. She hardly spoke about the encounter, but it was clear the man's presence had rattled her deeply. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she'd asked James if he thought the man would come back. James had assured her that she was safe, but the truth was, He didn't feel entirely certain himself. The encounter had raised questions he couldn't ignore, and he knew he needed answers if he was going to protect her. That night, as he sat in his study, James made a decision. He would find out more about Ellie's background, about the man who claimed to be her uncle, and about the life she'd led before he found her. It wasn't a choice he took lightly. He respected Ellie's privacy, and he knew she valued the independence and freedom she was just beginning to experience. But if this man truly intended to take her, James needed to understand who he was dealing with. This was about Ellie's safety, and he would rather risk her momentary discomfort than leave her vulnerable to a life that filled her with such fear. James began his research cautiously, using only the details Ellie had shared in their rare conversations about her past. He recalled the few things she'd mentioned: a town, a school she used to attend, fragments of a life that seemed far removed from the person she was now. Each piece was a puzzle. And he started with what little he knew, searching through online records and local forums. But the task proved more difficult than he'd expected. Ellie's life before him was almost a ghost, with only faint traces and no solid leads. As he delved deeper, he found himself wrestling with a growing sense of conflict. A part of him questioned whether it was his place to dig into her past, to uncover details she hadn't chosen to share. He wondered if he was crossing a line, betraying her trust even in his attempt to protect her. Yet each time he saw her flinch at a passing car or stiffen at the sound of footsteps outside, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just about respecting her privacy. It was about ensuring she wouldn't be forced back into a life that had clearly done her harm. Over the next few days, James became increasingly focused on finding answers. He reached out to a friend from his college days, an investigator, whom he trusted to handle the inquiry discreetly. He shared the few details he had, careful not to mention Ellie's name or any specifics that could identify her. His friend promised to look into it, though he warned James that this kind of search could take time. Still, knowing he had a professional helping put his mind at ease, even if only a little. Meanwhile, he continued to observe Ellie, looking for any clues in her behavior or her stories that might reveal more about her past. She remained closed off on the subject, though she seemed more at ease with him than she had been since the visit. She spent her days exploring the mansion, laughing with Max and occasionally joining him in the study, her presence a comforting reminder of the quiet bond they were building. But James noticed a subtle wariness in her, as if she were holding something back, afraid of being honest about what haunted her. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, James gently broached the subject. "Ellie," he began carefully, watching her reaction, "I know you haven't wanted to talk about what happened before you came here, and I understand if it's hard for you." She looked down, her face guarded, but she didn't stop him. "But if there's anything you feel comfortable sharing about the man who came, or about where you were before, it might help me keep you safe." He kept his tone soft, leaving her the space to respond or withdraw as she chose. Ellie was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the plate in her hands. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I don't know if he's really my uncle," she admitted, her voice shaky. "He just showed up one day after Mom left, said he was family, that he'd take care of me, but he never did. Not really." Her words were hesitant, as if she feared saying too much, but James could sense the relief in her voice as she shared the burden she'd been carrying. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it was enough to confirm James's suspicions. This man's intentions were anything but pure. The days following Ellie's revelation left James in a state of turmoil. He knew now, beyond any doubt, that the man who had come to his door was not someone who should be in her life, but the question of how to handle it weighed heavily on him. He was an outsider in her life, someone who had only recently come to know her, yet he felt responsible for her well-being in a way he hadn't anticipated. He didn't know what he'd do if the man came back, but he was determined to be prepared, whatever it took. Ellie's safety had become his highest priority, and he'd face any dilemma if it meant keeping her safe. Over the next week, James noticed a subtle but unmistakable change in Ellie. With the uncle temporarily out of the picture, she seemed to breathe easier, as if a weight had lifted. Her gaze softened, and she looked less like a child on the run, more like a young girl finding moments of peace for the first time. James sensed that the passing days were building a fragile sense of security within her, one he hoped would last. And as she relaxed, he felt her guard lower, little by little, as if she was slowly allowing herself to trust him more. Their interactions became more comfortable, and Ellie even began volunteering bits of her day-to-day experiences, sharing stories about small moments with Max, or things she found fascinating around the house. James listened, always encouraging her with gentle smiles and curious questions. He was careful not to pry, knowing that pushing too hard might break the delicate balance of trust they were building. He wanted her to feel that she could open up at her own pace, and she seemed to respond to his patience, like a flower slowly blooming in safe sunlight. One evening, after they'd finished a quiet dinner, Ellie stayed behind at the table, twirling her fork absent-mindedly. James glanced up from his cup of tea, sensing there was something on her mind. "Is there anything you want to talk about?" he asked gently, careful not to push, but offering her the space to share. Ellie was silent for a moment, her eyes distant, as if she were somewhere far away, lost in memories. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "He wasn't really my uncle, you know." James felt his heart ache at the words, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. Ellie's fingers fidgeted with her napkin, twisting it tightly as she spoke. "He just showed up one day, after Mom left, said he was family, but he never treated me like it." She paused, her gaze lowering to the table, and James could see the raw hurt and betrayal written on her face. "He'd leave me alone for days. Sometimes he'd forget to leave food." Her words were matter-of-fact, as if she'd grown used to the neglect, but James felt a surge of anger building inside him. "I'm so sorry, Ellie," he said softly, not knowing what else he could say. She looked up, and for a moment he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a need for understanding and validation that she was too young to put into words. She continued, her voice shaking slightly. "He'd tell me that I wasn't worth much, that nobody would want to keep me around for long, said I was too much trouble." Each word seemed to cut into her, and James felt the depth of her wounds as if they were his own. As Ellie spoke, James felt a fierce, protective instinct rise within him, a need to shelter her from any more pain, to be the person who would never abandon her or make her feel unwanted. "Ellie," he said, his voice firm but warm, "none of that is true. You're worth so much more than he ever made you believe." He leaned forward, meeting her gaze, wanting her to see the sincerity in his eyes. "You're not a burden, and you're not too much trouble. You deserve to be treated with kindness and respect, and I promise you, you'll have that here." She didn't respond right away, but he saw her eyes soften, a small glimmer of hope flickering within them. James could see that it would take time for her to truly believe his words, to unlearn the harmful messages she'd been told for so long. But he was willing to wait, to be patient and present, until she no longer doubted her own worth. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on hers, and she didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but one that felt like a monumental step toward healing. Over the next few days, Ellie began sharing more fragments of her past, each revelation offering James a clearer picture of the life she'd endured. She told him about the cold, empty apartments they'd stayed in, the days spent alone with nothing but her doll for company, and the strange people who came and went, each one leaving her feeling more invisible. She spoke of nights spent shivering under thin blankets, hungry and afraid, waiting for someone who never returned. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, a glimpse into the lonely world she'd known before. Listening to her, James felt a deep sadness mixed with anger, a fury at the man who'd made her feel so small and unimportant, and a sadness for the child she could have been if only someone had cared for her. He found himself more determined than ever to protect her, to give her the security and stability she had been denied. It wasn't just about keeping her safe from her so-called uncle anymore. It was about giving her a chance to experience childhood as it should have been, filled with kindness, warmth, and love. One night, as they sat by the fire, Ellie looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Her voice soft but steady. James felt his throat tighten, realizing the depth of her question. He took a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "Because I saw a part of myself in you," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "When I was younger, I had a lot of people around, but I still felt alone. I know what it's like to feel unwanted, Ellie, and I didn't want you to feel that way, not if I could help it." Ellie stared at him, a faint understanding dawning in her eyes. For the first time, she seemed to see him not as an authority figure or a rescuer, but as someone who had been through his own hardships. She nodded slowly, her hand reaching out to squeeze his, a silent gesture of gratitude that said more than words ever could. In that moment, James realized they were both healing together, finding solace in each other's presence, slowly mending the broken parts of themselves. As the days continued, Ellie's stories became less guarded, her words flowing with a newfound ease. She spoke of her dreams, her hopes, and the small things that brought her joy. She started to laugh more, her smile coming more freely, and James felt a warmth fill the house that he hadn't felt in years. Each story, each laugh, each smile was a reminder of the resilience she carried, a testament to the strength that had kept her going despite the hardships she'd faced. Watching her transform, James felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He saw not just the child she was, but the person she was becoming, shaped by the kindness and understanding she was finally receiving. He realized that, in a way, she was teaching him as much as he was helping her. Her resilience reminded him of the power of compassion, the strength found in connection, and the importance of never giving up on someone who needed a second chance. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden together, Ellie paused, looking up at him with a shy smile. "Do you think I could stay here for good?" she asked, her voice filled with both hope and fear. James felt a lump form in his throat as he met her gaze, seeing the vulnerability there. He knelt down, placing a hand on her shoulder, his voice filled with warmth. "Ellie, as long as you want to be here, this is your home, I promise." Ellie's smile widened, her eyes bright with happiness, and James felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He knew their journey wasn't over, that there would still be challenges ahead, but in that moment, he felt that they'd both come a long way. Ellie was no longer just a scared, lost child. She was becoming part of his life, a part he couldn't imagine being without. As they walked back to the house together, James realized that they were building something beautiful and lasting, one day, one shared story, and one small bond at a time. The first time James spotted the man lurking near the edge of his property, he felt a chill of dread run through him. It was a typical quiet afternoon. He and Ellie were in the garden, planting flowers as Max wandered nearby. From the corner of his eye, James noticed a figure near the property's fence, half hidden behind the trees. At first, he thought it was simply a hiker passing by. But as he focused, he recognized the slouched posture and unsettling gaze of the man who'd claimed to be Ellie's uncle. James's heart raced, and he quickly turned to Ellie, positioning himself to block her view. From that moment, James felt a shadow settle over their peaceful life. Days passed without incident. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The man's presence was a dark cloud hanging over him, and he knew he had to be cautious. He didn't want to frighten Ellie, but he could tell she sensed something was wrong. She asked him several times if everything was okay, her eyes full of worry. James tried to reassure her with small smiles and comforting words, though he could see she wasn't fully convinced. After a sleepless night spent listening for any unusual sounds, James decided to take action. Early the next morning, he contacted a security company to install cameras around the property. He wanted to ensure that every inch of his land was covered, especially the areas near the fence where he'd seen the man lurking. The workers arrived that afternoon, setting up cameras in key spots, at the gates, along the perimeter, and near the entrances to the house. As he supervised their work, James felt a mixture of relief and frustration. He hated that it had come to this, that his home, a place that had finally become warm and safe, was now under a constant threat. Ellie watched the workers install the cameras with a puzzled look, clearly sensing the tension in the air. "Why are they putting those up?" she asked one evening. Her voice laced with worry. James hesitated, debating how much he should reveal. Finally, he knelt down beside her, his expression serious but calm. "I just want to make sure we're safe," he said gently. "There's someone out there who doesn't have the best intentions, and I want to protect us." Ellie's face tightened, a flicker of fear crossing her eyes. She nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken message in his words. Over the next week, the cameras became a constant reminder of the threat looming over them. Every time he glanced at the monitors in his study, he felt a mix of relief and dread, scanning each image for any sign of the man. He also took further steps, reinforcing the locks on the doors and setting up motion sensor lights around the property. Ellie noticed these changes, her wariness growing as she sensed the tension in James. She began staying closer to him, clinging to his side whenever they ventured outside, her trust in him as her protector evident but tinged with fear. Late one night, just as James was preparing to turn in, he heard the low hum of the security alarm. His heart pounded as he raced to the monitor, his eyes scanning the screens for any sign of movement. There, near the gate, was a shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. The man stood just outside the fence. His posture relaxed but watchful, as if daring James to come out. James felt a surge of anger rise within him. This man was taunting him, testing the boundaries of his patience and resolve. He gritted his teeth, knowing he had to stay calm, to think clearly. Ellie, woken by the alarm, appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. James forced a smile, walking over to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Nothing to worry about," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Someone just set off the alarm, but they're not getting anywhere near us." She nodded. Though he could see the worry in her eyes, he led her back to her room, waiting by her door until she drifted off to sleep, the protective instinct within him stronger than ever. The next morning, James contacted the local police, sharing his concerns about the man's repeated appearances near his property. The officer he spoke with listened attentively, but his response was measured. "As long as he's not trespassing, there's not much we can do," the officer explained, his tone sympathetic but firm. James felt a pang of frustration. He knew the law was on the man's side for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this man was a ticking time bomb. He decided to remain vigilant, knowing he'd do whatever it took to protect Ellie, even if it meant taking matters into his own hands. Over the following days, the tension around the house grew. Ellie's laughter, once a constant, now felt rare and cautious. She'd grown more withdrawn, glancing out the window as if expecting the man to appear at any moment. James tried to distract her with small activities, taking her out to the garden, playing games, and encouraging her to focus on Max, who seemed to sense the unease in the air as well. But even Max's presence wasn't enough to erase the fear that had taken hold. James felt the strain in every interaction, his patience wearing thin as he awaited the next encounter. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, James noticed Ellie watching him with a serious expression. "Are we really safe here?" she asked, her voice small but determined. James looked at her, taking a moment to weigh his words. "Yes." "Ellie," he said softly, meeting her gaze with unwavering confidence. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're safe. This is your home now, and no one has the right to take that away from you." He could see her relax slightly, a faint glimmer of trust returning to her eyes. And though the threat was still very real, James knew he'd fight it with everything he had to protect the little girl who'd become his family. Over the following weeks, James felt a shift in his life, one he hadn't anticipated. The reality of his role as Ellie's protector, her guardian in every sense of the word, settled into his mind. This wasn't something he'd planned or prepared for. His life had been carefully constructed around independence, freedom, and the quiet of solitude. Yet now, as he watched Ellie's small footsteps echoing through the house, or her laughter as she played with Max in the garden, he realized how much that solitude had come at a cost. For the first time, he felt the joy of companionship in the truest sense. James found himself adjusting his routines, his priorities subtly rearranging around Ellie's presence. Where he once buried himself in work and schedules, he now looked forward to moments of connection, like her evening stories, her gentle knock on his study door, and her quiet company on weekend mornings. It was as if his world had expanded to accommodate someone else's needs and dreams, and in doing so, he found a new purpose. He began to plan his days around the simple joys of making her feel safe and supported, no longer driven by work alone. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Ellie leaned her head on his shoulder, something she'd never done before. James felt a swell of emotion he hadn't expected. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried a depth he couldn't ignore. It struck him that Ellie, who had every reason to distrust the world, was slowly but surely opening her heart to him. The thought filled him with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He understood now that he wasn't just providing a shelter, he was building a home for her, a place where she could learn to trust, to feel valued. He noticed small changes in himself too, little things like the way he approached decisions now. Considering how they would affect her, he found himself more patient, more empathetic, more aware of the weight his words carried. He'd never been one to think of himself as a fatherly figure, yet here he was, embracing a role that required him to nurture and protect. It wasn't something he could have ever imagined, but he welcomed it wholeheartedly. For the first time in his life, he felt that the choices he made had a deeper impact than just on his own success or happiness. They shaped Ellie's world too. Ellie, meanwhile, seemed to thrive in this environment. Her guard slowly lowered, and James began to see glimpses of the carefree child she might have been in a different life. She would chatter happily about small things, like the birds in the garden or a book she found in his library. He noticed her looking at him with a mixture of admiration and trust, something that warmed his heart and strengthened his resolve. She seemed to look to him for guidance, for reassurance. And the realization struck him deeply. She saw him as family. As Ellie grew more comfortable, she began to share small dreams and hopes that James could tell she'd kept buried for a long time. One afternoon, as they sat by the window watching the rain, she told him about her wish to someday visit the ocean. A place she'd only seen in pictures. James listened intently, vowing silently that he would do everything in his power to make her dreams a reality. In this way, he felt himself stepping into a parental role more naturally than he'd ever anticipated. The desire to protect her was joined by the wish to see her thrive, to experience joy and wonder in a world that had once seemed cold to her. There were moments when he'd reflect on his life before Ellie, the years spent in silence, his home filled with nothing but echoes. He realized now how hollow that life had been, how empty his ambitions felt without someone to share them with. His mansion had once symbolized his achievements, a testament to his hard work, but now it felt like more than just a house. With Ellie's laughter and presence, it had become a true home. The walls that once felt like barriers now seemed to hold warmth and belonging, a family he had chosen and who had chosen him in return. Gradually, James began to see that family wasn't defined by blood, but by the choices people made to stand by each other, to support and uplift one another. He'd never fully understood the power of chosen family until he felt the connection with Ellie. She had become a part of his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. But he embraced it with a profound sense of gratitude. This bond, forged through shared trust and mutual care, felt as real as any he'd known. He felt deeply grateful for the opportunity to be a guiding presence in her life and to be changed by her presence in his. One evening, after a long day, James found Ellie in his study, flipping through an old photo album he hadn't looked at in years. She pointed to a photo of him as a young man, a question in her eyes. "Were you happy back then?" she asked quietly. James was taken aback, realizing that he had never really asked himself that question. "I thought I was," he admitted, "but it was a different kind of happiness. I didn't know then what it meant to have someone to care for. You've shown me a new kind of happiness, Ellie, one that means more than anything else." Ellie's eyes softened, and she reached over, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. In that moment, James felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known was possible. This wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself, but it was the life he'd come to cherish. Ellie had filled a void he didn't even know existed, and he felt a surge of gratitude for the chance to be her guardian, her friend. And perhaps even the father figure she'd been missing. The path ahead might still hold challenges, but James knew he was ready to face them, for Ellie and for the new life they were building together. It was a bright, cold morning when the knock came on the door, loud, insistent, and entirely unwelcome. And James felt his stomach twist as he recognized the voice on the other side, a voice that had haunted both his and Ellie's peace for too long. The uncle had returned, but this time, he wasn't alone. Through the window, James saw the man standing on his porch, flanked by two uniformed police officers. Ellie, sensing the tension, stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale with dread. James turned to her, offering a reassuring nod before stepping toward the door. Taking a steadying breath, James opened the door, keeping his posture firm, his expression calm. "Mr. Cooper?" one of the officers asked. casting a glance between him and the man next to him. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the so-called uncle, whose face was twisted with impatience and barely contained anger. "This man claims that his niece, Ellie, is in your custody and that he's come to take her home," the officer continued, his tone professional but neutral. James felt his heart race, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand, officer, but I have reason to believe that Ellie is not safe with him." The man let out a scoff, his voice dripping with hostility. "She's my niece. I have every right to take her with me. This man has no legal claim to her." James clenched his fists. But he kept his composure, meeting the officer's gaze directly. "If you'll allow me, officer, I'd like to present evidence that this man has been neglectful, even abusive toward Ellie. She's terrified of him, and for good reason." He glanced back at Ellie, who was watching the scene unfold with wide, fearful eyes. His resolve hardened. He would fight for her no matter the cost. The officers exchanged a glance, one of them nodding. "We'll hear you out, Mr. Cooper, but please understand that without legal custody, the decision ultimately rests with us. We need substantial evidence to support any claim of neglect or abuse." James nodded. Understanding the gravity of the situation, he'd prepared for this moment, gathering documents, witness statements, and even medical records that supported Ellie's experiences. He had pieced together every bit of information she had shared with him, and it was time to make sure her voice was heard, even if it was through him. He invited the officers into the house, asking Ellie to wait in her room, hoping to shield her from the stress of the confrontation. She nodded, her face tight with anxiety, but trusting him completely. As she disappeared down the hall, James led the officers to his study, where he had carefully compiled the evidence he'd been collecting. He felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on him as he laid out the documents, hoping they would be enough to keep Ellie safe. "These are medical records and photos documenting instances of neglect and malnutrition," James explained, handing the officers a file. "And these," he continued, pointing to a stack of statements, "are statements from neighbors who observed Ellie's condition when she was in her uncle's care. Several noted that she was often left alone, unsupervised, and without basic needs being met." As he spoke, he felt a surge of anger, not just at the man who had caused Ellie harm, but at the system that had allowed her to be neglected in the first place. The officers examined the documents in silence, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. After a while, one of them looked up, his face set in a grim expression. "This is significant evidence, Mr. Cooper," he said, his tone more sympathetic now. "We'll need to follow up with an investigation, but based on what you've provided, we're inclined to proceed with caution regarding her custody." The other officer nodded in agreement, glancing over at the man waiting impatiently by the door. "For now, Ellie will remain here." The uncle reacted with fury, his voice rising as he tried to argue his case. "This is outrageous. You can't just take my family away from me because some rich guy has a fancy house and a few papers." James felt his patience wearing thin, but he refused to be provoked. He kept his gaze steady, his voice calm as he addressed the man directly. "This isn't about wealth. It's about her well-being. Ellie deserves a safe and loving home, and you've shown repeatedly that you're unwilling or unable to provide that." Frustrated, the man stormed out of the house, shouting threats and promises that he would be back and wouldn't give up without a fight. The officers remained, offering James a reassuring nod. "We'll file a report with child services, and given the evidence, it's likely that a judge will grant you temporary custody during the investigation." Relief flooded over James, but he knew this was only the beginning. There would be court hearings, legal battles, and long discussions ahead. but he was ready to fight, knowing that Ellie's safety and future depended on it. In the days that followed, James worked closely with his lawyer, gathering even more evidence and preparing for the inevitable court proceedings. He met with social workers, shared everything he knew about Ellie's life with her so-called uncle, and reiterated his desire to provide her with a stable, loving home. Ellie, meanwhile, clung to him with a newfound sense of security, understanding in her own way that he was fighting for her. Their bond grew stronger, and James felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to make this arrangement permanent. The court date finally arrived, and James entered the courtroom with Ellie by his side, her hand clutching his tightly. The uncle was there as well, casting dark glances at them both, his face a mask of resentment. James ignored him, focusing instead on the judge, who reviewed the case with meticulous attention. The evidence James had provided was laid out, each piece contributing to a story of neglect, abandonment, and broken trust. Ellie's statements, though brief and hesitant, were powerful. She spoke quietly but clearly, describing the nights she'd been left alone, the hunger, the loneliness, and the fear, and James felt a surge of pride watching her testify, seeing the courage she displayed despite her young age. Her words painted a vivid picture of a life no child should have to endure, and he could see the impact they had on the judge and the jury. His own testimony was equally heartfelt, describing the changes he'd witnessed in Ellie, her growing sense of security and trust, and his commitment to providing her with a home where she could heal and thrive. He spoke from the heart, sharing his own journey of transformation and the love that had grown between them. The uncle made his own arguments, but they were weak in comparison. Filled with excuses and half-truths that only served to highlight his irresponsibility. His defense painted him as a victim of circumstance, a man trying his best but facing challenges. However, the evidence against him was too overwhelming, and it was clear to everyone in the room that Ellie's best interests lay elsewhere. James felt a mix of relief and resolve as he watched the judge listen carefully, weighing each word, each piece of evidence, and finally reaching a decision. After a long pause, the judge cleared his throat, looking at Ellie with a gentle expression. It is clear to this court that Ellie's needs are best served in a stable, supportive environment, one that Mr. Cooper has demonstrated he can provide, he announced, his voice firm. I am hereby granting temporary custody of Ellie to James Cooper, with the possibility of permanent guardianship pending further evaluation. James felt a wave of emotion wash over him, relief and gratitude mingling with a fierce pride. Ellie's hand squeezed his, and he looked down to see her smiling, her eyes shining with tears. As they left the courtroom, James felt the weight of the past months lift, replaced by a sense of hope and anticipation for the future. He knew there would still be challenges, that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But he was ready for it, ready to face whatever came their way. Ellie was no longer just a child in need of protection. She was his family, the person who had filled his life with meaning and purpose. Together, they walked out of the courthouse, hand in hand, ready to build the life they both deserved, one built on trust, love, and the unbreakable bond they'd fought so hard to protect. With the legal custody process complete, James felt an overwhelming sense of relief and peace wash over him. The weight of uncertainty was finally gone, and the quiet of his once lonely mansion now felt welcoming, filled with a warmth he hadn't known in years. There was no more lurking threat, no fear of Ellie being taken away. For the first time, the future felt not only secure, but full of promise. This peace was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was quiet and steady, a joy that permeated his entire being. Ellie, too, began to change in ways that filled James with joy and pride. Freed from her constant anxiety and the trauma of her past, she grew into herself, discovering new layers of confidence and happiness. She was no longer that frightened, withdrawn child he'd found in the woods. She was now full of laughter, curiosity, and resilience. She roamed the house with ease, transforming every room into a place of comfort and light. Even Max seemed more at ease, as if sensing the stability and calm that had settled over their lives. Each morning, James would find Ellie waiting at the breakfast table, often reading one of the books she'd borrowed from his study, her face lit with the easy calm that had become her new expression. The quiet breakfasts they shared were no longer filled with hesitation or worry. Instead, they were filled with light-hearted conversations about Ellie's dreams, her plans for the garden, or her thoughts on the day ahead. James cherished these moments, feeling an unspoken bond deepening between them in a mutual understanding that words couldn't capture. James noticed with quiet amazement how his own priorities had shifted. The drive that had once pushed him to achieve, to compete, had softened, replaced by a contentment he hadn't known was possible. His days, once centered on work and business, now revolved around Ellie and their life together. Work had become a part of his life, not the focus of it, and he found fulfillment in being present, in being the person she trusted. Watching her flourish made him realize that success wasn't measured in wealth or status, but in the simple, shared moments of daily life. As Ellie continued to bloom, she found new hobbies and passions, each one adding more vibrance to their shared life. She took a particular interest in the garden, spending hours outside, planting flowers, vegetables, and herbs. She had even designated a small corner of the garden for Max, planting flowers she thought he would like. James joined her often, his hands getting dirty alongside hers, the two of them laughing as they planted, watered, and tended to the growing life around them. The garden had once been an afterthought, but now it was a shared space, a place that symbolized their growth together. They established new rituals and traditions that gave rhythm to their days. Sunday mornings became their time for homemade pancakes, a tradition Ellie had suggested one morning. They'd cook together, spilling flour and laughing as they tried different recipes. Sometimes they'd go for walks through the nearby woods, retracing the path where they'd first met. Each ritual, each tradition became a thread in the tapestry of their life together, weaving memories that James knew he would hold on to for the rest of his life. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Ellie looked at him with a serious expression. "Do you think I'm going to stay here forever?" she asked quietly. Her eyes full of hope and a trace of lingering doubt. James felt his heart swell as he looked at her, understanding the depth of her question. "Ellie, as long as you want to be here, this is your home. We're family now, and family doesn't change." She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that spoke of her newfound sense of belonging. In that moment, he saw the final remnants of fear fade from her eyes, replaced by the peace she'd fought so hard to find. With each passing day, James felt his own transformation deepen. He understood now that Ellie wasn't the only one who had been saved. She had saved him too, filling the emptiness he hadn't realized was consuming him. The mansion, once cold and echoing, now felt alive, filled with laughter, shared stories, and the warmth of companionship. He found himself more patient, more at peace, his life anchored by the presence of someone he loved more than he'd thought possible. Ellie had become his world, and he embraced that reality fully, with a gratitude that ran to his core. As time went on, Ellie's confidence continued to grow, both in her relationship with James and in her identity. She started school, making friends and excelling in her classes. She often returned home with stories of her day, her face lit with excitement. James marveled at the way she had adapted, the resilience and courage she displayed as she explored this new life. She spoke with pride about her achievements, her favorite subjects, and her dreams for the future. Each day, she blossomed a bit more, and James felt privileged to witness her transformation. Late one night, as they sat on the porch looking up at the stars, Ellie spoke softly. "I used to think I wasn't good enough, that no one would want me." Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady, filled with a quiet strength. James felt his heart break for the child she had been, but he met her gaze with unwavering love. "Ellie, you are more than enough," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You're brave, strong, and full of so much light. I'm honored to be part of your life, and nothing could make me prouder." She nodded, smiling through tears, her face a picture of peace and acceptance. Their life together continued to evolve, and James realized he had found the family he'd once given up on. In caring for Ellie, he had discovered the depth of his own capacity to love and to be vulnerable. He had become a better person through her, learning patience, kindness, and empathy. He no longer saw his mansion as a symbol of success, but as a true home, a place filled with love and laughter. Each room had memories now, each space transformed by Ellie's presence, each moment a reminder of the life they had built together. On a cool autumn afternoon, they went on a picnic in the woods, the same woods where he'd found her that fateful day. They sat together, sharing sandwiches and cider, talking about their plans for the future. Ellie spoke of wanting to travel, to see the ocean, and James promised they'd make that trip one day. The air was filled with the scent of pine, and as they sat in comfortable silence, James felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The life he had now was more than he could have ever dreamed, and he knew that this bond, this family, was the greatest gift he'd ever received. Over time, James and Ellie's bond became something sacred, a relationship defined not by obligation, but by love and choice. He knew that she would always have questions about her past, that parts of her journey would remain painful, but he also knew she was strong enough to face them. They often talked openly about the hardships they'd both endured, sharing memories and lessons, each finding healing in the other's presence. Through these conversations, James saw the depth of Ellie's resilience, her ability to overcome and redefine herself, and he knew he'd be there to support her every step of the way. One night, as they sat by the fire, Ellie leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Thank you, James," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his heart full. "Thank you, Ellie," he replied, his voice soft, "for showing me what it means to love and be loved." They sat there in silence, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them, a perfect moment of peace and fulfillment. James felt that, for the first time, he had truly found his purpose, a purpose rooted not in ambition, but in love and the family they had built together. As they continued to live, laugh, and grow together, James knew that the transformation he had undergone was lasting. Profound and irreplaceable, he had become the person he was meant to be, not through wealth or success, but through the simple act of being there for someone who needed him. Ellie had given him a reason to live fully, to be present, and to find joy in the smallest moments. His life, once defined by solitude, was now rich with connection, and he knew he would carry this peace, this love, and this sense of family with him always. With Ellie officially under his care, James felt a renewed sense of purpose as they entered this next phase of life together. The journey they'd been on so far was filled with trials, each one strengthening their bond and reinforcing his commitment to give her a life full of love and safety. As the season changed and the days grew warmer, he knew it was time to focus on building a future that would reflect all they had overcome. This was no longer just about providing shelter, it was about building a home where she could truly thrive. Part of this new beginning meant allowing Ellie the chance to grow independently, to find her own place in the world. After months of living in the quiet safety of the mansion, they decided that it was time for her to attend school. The decision filled them both with excitement and a little bit of anxiety. Ellie was eager to make friends and experience the things she'd missed, yet there was a trace of fear in her eyes, a lingering worry about what others might think or how they'd treat her. James reassured her, promising that she could come to him about anything. On the first day of school, James drove Ellie. Her backpack neatly packed, her face a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She waved to him as she entered the building, and he found himself feeling both proud and a bit sentimental. Watching her walk into this new chapter felt like watching a child take her first steps. It was a milestone he hadn't imagined he'd witness, and it filled him with both joy and gratitude. He wanted her to know the world outside their home, to experience friendships, challenges, and triumphs of her own. Each afternoon, when Ellie returned from school, she would excitedly share stories about her day. She'd talk about new friends, her favorite teachers, and the things she was learning. Her stories brought life into the house, filling the rooms with laughter and warmth. For James, these moments were priceless. He'd listen attentively, asking questions, cherishing every detail she shared. The house that had once felt too quiet now brimmed with Ellie's joy. Her dreams and her boundless curiosity. James marveled at how far they had both come, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. With Ellie settling into her new routine, James focused on making their home a sanctuary, a place where she could always feel safe and loved. He made small adjustments around the house, adding a cozy reading nook for her in the study, setting up an art corner in the living room, and designing a small garden area where she could grow her favorite flowers. These touches were his way of showing her that this was her space too, a place where her personality, her passions, and her dreams could flourish. Ellie was thrilled with each change, her eyes lighting up with delight at each new addition. The weekends became their time to bond and explore together. They would plan small outings, visiting nearby parks, exploring local libraries, and sometimes going to the beach. Ellie's love for the ocean, which she'd mentioned long ago, had become a shared passion. They would spend hours walking along the shore, collecting seashells and splashing in the waves. These trips became cherished memories, each outing a testament to the new life they were building together, one filled with joy, freedom, and a sense of belonging that neither had known before. Ellie's newfound social life also brought new friends into their world. She would occasionally invite her friends over, and James took pleasure in watching her form these connections. He loved seeing her in her element, laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying the simple joys of childhood. The house that had once felt so isolating was now a place filled with youthful energy. Laughter echoing through the halls. Max, ever the loyal companion, joined in the fun, happily bouncing around whenever Ellie's friends visited. It was as if the house itself had come alive, responding to the warmth and laughter within its walls. With each passing month, James found himself growing more at ease in his role as Ellie's guardian. He was no longer the solitary man he'd once been. His world was now anchored in the love he had for Ellie and the life they were building. He no longer felt the need to prove himself through work or ambition. His success was now defined by the simple, beautiful moments they shared. He began to see that the true measure of his life was the happiness he saw in Ellie's eyes. The trust she placed in him and the home they had created together. Ellie continued to blossom, her confidence growing as she navigated her new life. She excelled in school, made strong friendships, and began exploring new interests, from art to science. Her teachers would often send home notes of praise, remarking on her curiosity and kindness. James treasured these moments, proud of her resilience and her ability to thrive despite the challenges she had faced. He realized that he was no longer just a protector. He was her cheerleader, her mentor, and the steady presence she could rely on. Their evenings were filled with shared routines that had become small but meaningful traditions. They would cook dinner together, experimenting with new recipes, sometimes resulting in a mess that left them both laughing. After dinner, they'd sit by the fire, reading or discussing their day. James cherished these quiet, simple moments, knowing they were creating memories that would last a lifetime. It was in these unassuming routines that he found a profound sense of peace, a joy that came from knowing that they were both exactly where they needed to be. One day, as they worked together in the garden, Ellie looked up at him, her face serious but hopeful. "Do you think we'll always be together?" she asked. Her voice soft. James knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "As long as you want, Ellie. This is your home for as long as you need it." She smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet assurance, and James felt an overwhelming gratitude for the journey they had shared. In that moment, he knew that they had both found what they were searching for, a family built on trust, love, and choice. James also took steps to secure their future, ensuring that his estate, his resources, and his life would continue to support Ellie, no matter what lay ahead. He met with his attorney, updating his will, creating trust funds, and setting aside resources for Ellie's education and well-being. It was his way of promising her that she would never again have to worry about stability or security, that she would always have a home and a future. Each decision, each document signed, was a step towards cementing the life they had built. A life rooted in love and commitment. As Ellie's birthday approached, James planned a celebration to mark the special occasion. It was a simple gathering with her closest friends, yet it was full of laughter, games, and joy. James watched her blow out the candles, her eyes sparkling with happiness. And he felt a sense of pride and contentment that words couldn't capture. This wasn't just a party, it was a celebration of her life, her resilience, and the family they had created together. He knew that they had both transformed, and this birthday was a symbol of the bright future ahead. Looking back on their journey, James marveled at how much they had both changed. The man who once valued solitude and independence had discovered a deeper meaning in the bond they shared. And Ellie, the child who had been scared and uncertain, was now confident, joyful, and full of dreams. They were both healing, both growing, and both finding strength in each other. Their journey had been challenging, but it had led them to a place of peace and fulfillment that neither had ever imagined. With each day that passed, James and Ellie embraced the life they had created together, a life that was rich with laughter, love, and hope. They looked toward the future with excitement, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. Their home, once a cold, silent mansion, was now filled with warmth, laughter, and the beauty of a chosen family. This new beginning was a promise of love, of support, and of the unwavering bond they shared. They had found their way to each other, and in doing so, they had found a home. Late one evening, as the quiet settled over the house and the stars blinked softly outside his study window, James found himself reflecting on the journey he and Ellie had shared. The house, once a testament to his independence, now felt like a sanctuary filled with memories, laughter, and love. In the stillness, he could feel the weight of everything they'd endured, every challenge they'd faced, every moment that had brought them closer. He'd always thought that family was something fixed, determined by blood. But Ellie had shown him that family was a choice, a bond forged in trust and love. He thought back to the man he'd been before Ellie entered his life. Back then, his priorities were clear and narrow: work, success, personal achievements. He had equated purpose with ambition, fulfillment with solitude. Yet Ellie had arrived like a gentle force, softening the edges he'd built around himself, drawing out parts of him he didn't even know existed. She had reminded him that life wasn't measured by individual accomplishments, but by the impact he made on the lives of others. He realized now that he had gained more than he'd ever thought possible, not from his work, but from the love they shared. Ellie, too, had transformed over the months they'd been together. He marveled at the resilience she displayed, her ability to trust again after everything she'd been through. She had once been a quiet, frightened child who flinched at the smallest sounds and hesitated to trust anyone. But now she walked with a quiet confidence, her eyes bright, her laughter filling the spaces that had once felt cold and empty. She had found strength in herself, and he felt privileged to have been part of that journey, to witness her blossom into a vibrant, joyful child. Watching her had taught James so much about the nature of love and trust. He had come to see that true love was patient and steady, not something that demanded immediate gratitude or reciprocation. Love, he'd learned, was the quiet, everyday actions that built a foundation of safety and kindness. He had seen it in the way she slowly opened up to him, in the trust that took months to build, but felt as if it had always been there. This trust wasn't something he'd inherited by birth. It was something they had chosen each day to give to each other. One night, as they sat by the fire, James shared some of these thoughts with Ellie. He told her about his own family, about the loneliness he'd felt even when surrounded by people. He explained how she had filled a void he hadn't realized was there, how she'd brought light into a life he'd thought was complete, but was in fact missing something essential. Ellie listened, her eyes soft with understanding, and he felt a sense of peace wash over him. She nodded quietly, as if she, too, understood the importance of the bond they'd formed. Ellie, for her part, expressed her own reflections, telling James how grateful she was for the home they'd created together. She spoke about the comfort she felt knowing she could rely on him, knowing she had someone who would always be there. It was a simple statement, but it carried a weight that James knew came from her past. For a child who had once been abandoned, the idea of stability, of someone who would stay, was a gift beyond measure. "You taught me what it feels like to be loved," she whispered, her words bringing a lump to James's throat. As they sat there, James realized that in many ways they had healed each other. Ellie had given him purpose, a sense of connection he hadn't known he needed. And he had given her a home, a place where she could grow and feel safe. The beauty of their relationship lay in its simplicity. Two people who, despite their differences, had come together to create a family based on love and choice. The bond they shared was rooted in kindness, in the daily acts of care that said, "I am here, and I will always be here." James thought about the years he'd spent believing that family was something beyond his reach, a concept reserved for others. He had grown up in a household that valued success over emotional connection, a place where love was often overshadowed by expectations and rigid standards. Yet here, in this quiet house with Ellie, he had found a family that didn't require perfection or achievement. He had found a love that was gentle, forgiving, and unconditional. It was a love that had nothing to do with biology, but everything to do with choice. The impact of their relationship reached beyond just the two of them. James noticed that even his interactions with others had changed. He had become more patient, more empathetic, more understanding. Ellie had taught him to listen deeply, to see beyond the surface, to appreciate the quiet, often unspoken needs of others. He found himself valuing the connections he formed, realizing that, like with Ellie, each relationship was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to offer kindness. His world had expanded in ways he hadn't anticipated, all because of a young girl who'd shown him the true meaning of family. Looking back, James realized that every hardship they'd faced had been a stepping stone, each obstacle an opportunity to grow closer. The custody battle, the moments of doubt, the uncertainty, all of it had forged a bond that was unbreakable. He knew that their relationship hadn't been easy, but he wouldn't trade a single moment of it. The struggles had strengthened their trust, deepened their connection, and reminded him of the resilience of love. In the end, every challenge had been worth it, leading them to the peace and fulfillment they now shared. As Ellie's birthday approached, they decided to celebrate not just another year of her life, but the journey they'd taken together. James wanted to make it special, a reminder of everything they had overcome. He spent days planning, filling the house with decorations, baking a cake, and setting up her favorite flowers around the garden. When the day arrived, Ellie's face lit up with joy, her laughter filling the air as they celebrated together. It was a simple but profound moment, a testament to the life they'd built and the love that had carried them through. That evening, after the celebration had ended and the house had fallen silent, James sat alone for a moment, reflecting on what this day meant. It wasn't just a birthday. It was a celebration of a family formed not by blood but by choice. He felt a deep gratitude, not only for Ellie, but for the person he had become through knowing her. She had shown him a depth of love and purpose he hadn't thought possible. He knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together, bound by the love they'd chosen to give each other. In his final reflection, James understood that family was not a matter of fate or birthright. It was a bond that grew from trust, respect, and a commitment to stand by one another. He had found in Ellie a kindred spirit, someone who needed him as much as he needed her. Together, they had formed a family defined not by obligation, but by the desire to love, to protect, and to nurture each other. He knew that their relationship was unique, born out of hardship, but strengthened by choice. It was, in every sense, the truest form of family. James looked over at Ellie, who had fallen asleep on the couch, her face peaceful and relaxed. Watching her, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride and fulfillment. She was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he was her father, not by birth but by heart. He realized that this was the legacy he wanted to leave behind, a legacy of love, of kindness, of chosen family. He promised himself that he would always be there for her, that he would continue to create a life where she felt cherished, safe, and loved. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, James whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought him here. He understood now that family wasn't something one was born into. It was something one built piece by piece with love, patience, and choice. He and Ellie had found each other when they needed it most, filling the voids in each other's hearts. They had formed a family, not out of necessity, but out of a profound and beautiful decision to love each other. And as he closed his eyes, James knew that this was the life he had always been meant to live.